"Dad, nobody cares about an old watch." My son said it the way you'd swat a fly, not even looking up from his phone, his voice carrying across the entire private dining room of the Carolyn Club like he'd said it into a microphone. 40 years. I built Marsh Building Supply from a single rented storefront in Henrico County to a chain of 11 locations across Virginia and the Carolinas. 40 years of 5 a.m. mornings, of loading trucks in the January cold, of shaking hands with contractors who judged a man by whether he kept his word. I handed all of it to my son 4 years ago, when my heart started sending me messages I couldn't ignore anymore. I handed it to him on one condition: take care of the people who depend on us, and take care of me. He made that promise in this exact room. Now he was sitting at the head of a table full of investors and weekend golf partners, wearing a suit that cost more than my first month's rent, and telling me nobody cared about what I'd brought. What I'd brought was a silver pocket watch. It had belonged to my late wife Grace's father, a machinist from Roanoke who'd worked 30 years at the same plant and never complained once. When Grace and I got married, her mother pressed it into my hand and said, "Harold was a man who kept his time and kept his word. You seem like the same kind." I kept that watch in a cedar box on my dresser for 38 years. I brought it to the restaurant for my grandson Finn's 9th birthday because I wanted to give him something that meant something. Not a gift card, not some toy he'd forget by Tuesday, something with weight to it. My son had other plans. He picked it up off the table before Finn could even reach for it. He turned it over twice, clicked it open, and let out a short dismissive sound through his nose. "It doesn't even run," he said. He set it down in the breadbasket. "Dad, the kid wants a gaming setup. He doesn't want a museum piece." He looked around the table, and a couple of his golf buddies chuckled. My daughter-in-law Nadine smiled into her wine glass the way she always did when she thought she was winning something. "It can be wound," I said quietly. "I'll show him how." "It's broken," my son said, his tone closing the subject. Then, because he wanted to make sure everyone at that table understood the hierarchy, he added, "Look, I don't know why you keep doing this. You live in my guest house, you eat with us. I've been more than generous." He picked up his phone again. "Just try to keep up, okay? The world moved on." I looked at Finn. He was staring at the tablecloth, his jaw tight. 9 years old, and he already knew enough to be ashamed of his grandfather being talked to that way. That was the part that landed deepest, not the insult itself, but that my grandson had learned to swallow it right alongside me. I reached across, took the watch from the breadbasket, and slipped it into my jacket pocket. I didn't say another word. I pushed my chair back, stood up, and walked out of the Carolyn Club without excusing myself. My son called something after me. I didn't catch what it was, and I didn't try. My name is Leland Marsh. I'm 67 years old, and what my son said that night was the last thing he ever said to me as the CEO of my company. I walked 14 blocks back to the house, not because I had to. My truck was in the lot, but because I needed the cold air and the dark streets to think. Richmond in November is not a gentle city. The wind comes off the James River with a bite to it, and it doesn't care who you are. I'd always liked that about it. I had been making excuses for my son for 4 years. I told myself the pressure of running a business changes a man. I told myself Nadine had too much influence over him. I told myself he was still learning how to carry the weight of the thing I built. I had bent myself into knots, trying to give him the benefit of every doubt, because he was my son, and because Grace would have wanted me to try. But Grace was gone, and the man at that table wasn't who I thought I'd raised. I let myself into the guest house at the back of the property, a converted carriage house, small but decent. Nadine had offered it when I first moved in, saying it gave me privacy. What it gave her was plausible deniability. I was close enough to babysit Finn when they needed me, far enough away that I didn't interfere with their lifestyle. I sat at the small wooden desk by the window. I took the pocket watch out of my jacket and set it in front of me. I looked at it for a long time. Then I pulled out a phone Nadine didn't know I had, a prepaid I'd bought 6 months ago when I started keeping notes. I dialed a number I'd been hoping I'd never have to use. Monroe picked up on the second ring. 41 years I'd known the man. He'd drafted my first business incorporation, my partnership agreements, my wife's estate, and the revocable living trust I'd set up before I handed the keys to my son. Monroe never panicked and he never judged. He just listened. "It's Leland," I said. A brief pause. Then, "I've been wondering when this call was coming." I told him what happened at the restaurant. I told him about the watch and the breadbasket and the golf buddies laughing. I told him about Finn's face. When I finished, Monroe was quiet for a moment. "You want to activate the trustee succession provision," he said. It wasn't a question. "I want everything," I said. "Pull him off the payroll. Remove him as operating manager. Transfer the LLC authority back to the trust. The business checking, the operating lines, freeze them first thing when the banks open." "It'll hit around 6 tomorrow morning," Monroe said. "He won't be able to authorize spending until you say so. Give him 48 hours before payroll is affected. The employees didn't do anything wrong." I thought about it. But his and Nadine's personal accounts, the joint account tied to the trust allowance, cut that off tonight. Done. What about the property? "The guest house is mine, always has been. The main house is under the trust as well. I'll give him a week to vacate. 7 days is more than fair." Monroe typed something. "And you, Leland? Where are you going?" "I've got a room at the Omni," I said. "I booked it 2 weeks ago." I packed one bag. I left the guest house the way I'd found it. On the kitchen counter, I set a single piece of paper with one item beside it. The note said, "You told me to keep up with the world. I did. It was always my world, son. You were just visiting." And next to the note, I left the pocket watch, wound and running. I'd oiled the mechanism before I packed. Let them figure out what that meant. My son's morning routine started at 7:15. I knew this because I'd observed it for 4 years, the same way I'd once observed the habits of suppliers before I signed contracts with them. He liked his coffee first. He liked to check his email before he showered. He was meticulous about his schedule and fragile when it broke. I was sitting in a corner booth at a diner on Carey Street when I imagined the moment his routine broke. He would have opened his banking app out of habit. The joint account he and Nadine used for restaurants, travel, the country club membership, it would have shown nothing. Account access suspended by trust grantor. He would have thought it was a glitch and refreshed it 3 times before he stopped refreshing. Then he would have called the office. His assistant would have transferred him to the comptroller, who would have told him the business accounts were frozen, pending a trustee review, and that a letter had been sent designating Monroe's firm as acting trustee with full operational authority. And then the comptroller would have said the words that I suspected my son had never truly understood until that exact morning. "Mr. Marsh is listed as the grantor. We have to follow his instructions." I imagined the silence on his end of that call. I imagined the moment the word grantor fully landed, not as a formality on some document he'd signed without reading carefully, but as a loaded word meaning I had never truly handed over anything. I had loaned it to him, conditionally, and I had just called the loan. He arrived at Monroe's office at 9:30. I know because Monroe sent me a single text. "He's here." I could picture the rest well enough. My son had a way of entering rooms, always slightly too loud, always slightly too large for the space. He would have expected Monroe to flinch. Monroe doesn't flinch. He's been practicing law in Richmond for 4 decades, and he has seen everything. What Monroe told my son was simple. The revocable trust I'd established before the business transfer included specific provisions. In the event the designated manager engaged in conduct unbecoming the trust's purpose, which Monroe had carefully defined to include financial misappropriation, abuse of trust assets for personal enrichment, and conduct that brought disrepute to the Marsh name, the grantor could revoke operating authority without court approval or advance notice. The terms had been plain. My son had signed acknowledging them. He simply hadn't believed I would ever pull the trigger. Monroe told me later that my son said, "He's an old man living in my backyard. He doesn't have the spine to do this." Monroe had looked at him over his glasses and said, "He did it last night, Weston, while you were sleeping." Nadine's reaction I watched through a different lens entirely. Monroe had flagged something to me 6 weeks earlier, a routine review of the trust's subsidiary accounts. Monroe did these annually, had turned up a pattern. Small transfers, never more than $4,000 at a time, from the company's vendor relations account to a personal account we hadn't authorized. The amounts were too modest to trip the automated alerts. Done over 18 months, they totaled just over $63,000. The account they'd been routed to was in Nadine's name only, a savings account at a credit union in Chesterfield County that my son almost certainly didn't know existed. I'd told Monroe to note it and say nothing. I wanted to see what she did with it. What she did was keep doing it, right up until the night of the birthday dinner. When my son came home from Monroe's office that afternoon, on foot, since Monroe had informed him that the company vehicles registered under the trust were also frozen, Nadine was waiting. I know this because she called me. She was the first one to reach out. "Leland," she said, her voice careful and sweet in a way that told me she'd rehearsed it. "I think there's been a terrible misunderstanding. Weston didn't mean anything by what he said last night. You know how he gets in front of people. He's going to call and apologize." "Nadine," I said, "I want to ask you something. The account at the credit union in Chesterfield. How much did you think you needed before you felt safe?" The line went so quiet I thought the call had dropped. "Monroe has the records," I said. $63,412. That's not a misunderstanding." I heard her breathing change. "I want you to think carefully about your next step," I said. "Because you have a son who watches everything you do. Don't make the wrong choice for him to learn from." She hung up. By evening, Monroe had received a call from Nadine's attorney. She wanted to cooperate with the trust's financial review in exchange for a deferred arrangement. She was willing to provide documentation of my son's financial decisions as CEO. Decisions she claimed he had pressured her to facilitate. She said there were 3 other accounts. She said the total was closer to $200,000. I sat with that number for a while, then I went to sleep. I should have anticipated what happened the following morning. I did, actually, which was why I'd asked Monroe to arrange someone to keep an eye on Finn's school as a precaution. Monroe had thought I was being overcautious. He stopped thinking that at 11:15, when his contact at the school called to report that a man matching my son's description had pulled up and, claiming a family emergency, had checked Finn out of class. Legally, he was still listed as the primary parent. There was nothing the school could do. I was in Monroe's office when the call came in. I felt something go cold in my chest that was older and quieter than fear. Finn was 9 years old. He was the only person in that family who hadn't done a single thing wrong. He was the whole reason I'd stayed as long as I had. My son drove to a park off Monument Avenue. I tracked the location through the tablet he'd given Finn for schoolwork. Still logged into the family account on my son's old plan, which Monroe hadn't yet deactivated because we'd forgotten it existed. We found the location in under 4 minutes. I drove myself, no intermediaries. I found them on a bench near the duck pond. Finn was eating a granola bar and looking at his shoes. My son was on a borrowed phone, arguing with someone. When he saw my car pull up, he stood. He looked like a man who'd been awake for 2 days, which I suppose he had. His jacket was wrinkled. He hadn't shaved. The confidence that had filled the dining room at the Carrion Club the night before last was completely gone. What was left was just a man on a park bench in November. "I figured you'd find him," he said. "He was trying for control and it wasn't working. I just wanted to talk without lawyers." "So talk," I said. Finn looked up at me. His eyes were red at the rims. "Grandpa," he said very quietly. "Come here, buddy," I said. My son put his hand on Finn's shoulder. "Stay put, Finn." He looked at me. "I need you to reverse the trust provisions. Put the company back. I know I went too far at dinner. I know that. But what you're doing, you're destroying 20 years of work. My work. You can't just take that." "Sit with me for a minute," I said. He looked surprised, but he sat. Finn sat between us, and I could feel the tension in the set of the boy's small shoulders. "Do you know what your grandmother Grace left when she died?" I asked. My son frowned. "Her estate, some savings. The house was already $240,000, I said. "Her life insurance. She'd been paying into a whole life policy since before you were born. She told me once she did it because she grew up poor, and she was never going to leave the people she loved with nothing." I looked at my hands for a moment. When she died, that money sat in probate for 8 months. I didn't touch it. I waited, And then I used it to buy the second location, the one in Charlottesville. That purchase was what let us become a chain instead of just a store. My son was quiet. Marsh Building Supply wasn't built on my stubbornness alone, I said. It was built on your mother's discipline, her sacrifice, and then my stubbornness on top of that for the next 35 years. I looked at him straight. You didn't build it, son. You managed it. For 4 years, you managed something your mother and I built together. And when you sat at that table and told me I was living off what you'd built, you were wrong. And somewhere underneath all of it, you knew you were wrong. He looked away toward the pond. His jaw worked back and forth. Monroe has the founding capital documents, I said. They're part of the trust records. If this goes before a judge, those documents are on the table on day 1. I stood up. I put my hand briefly on Finn's head. You took him out of school. That's something the police will need to hear about. And the Financial Review is going to find exactly what Nadine has already told Monroe it will find. I looked at my son one last time. I didn't do this to destroy you. I did it because you held your grandmother's father's watch over a breadbasket and said nobody cared. And I decided I was done pretending that was an accident. I took Finn's hand. He came without looking back. My son sat on that bench for a long time after we left. Monroe's contact drove by 20 minutes later, and he was still there, watching the ducks. The proceedings moved quickly once Nadine provided her documentation. The Forensic Review turned up $217,000 in misappropriated funds, vendor rebates redirected to personal accounts, company credit charges for personal travel logged as business expenses, consulting fees paid to a Delaware LLC my son had quietly registered, that had never performed any actual work. Monroe walked me through the summary one afternoon in his office, and when he finished I sat there just thinking about how much energy it must have taken to maintain all of that, to keep all those threads from crossing. It was more work than simply being honest would have been. That was what I couldn't get over. My son was charged with wire fraud and misappropriation of business funds. His attorney argued that as de facto owner, he'd had broad discretionary authority over company accounts. Monroe had anticipated this argument and had spent the 3 years prior making sure the trust documents answered it in language so plain a first-year law student could follow it. The argument didn't survive the preliminary hearing. Nadine's cooperation bought her a reduced charge and a suspended sentence. She agreed to repay her portion from the savings she'd been quietly building for herself. She also agreed, through her attorney, to my petition for temporary guardianship of Finn. Her lawyer tried to call it a concession. I called it the first genuinely responsible thing she'd done in 4 years. The morning the judge signed the guardianship order, I drove to Ginter Park Elementary and picked Finn up early. He was waiting outside with his backpack and his jacket half-zipped the way he always wore it, no matter how cold it got. "Are they coming back?" he asked in the car. Kids cut to the point faster than adults. They don't have the same investment in the long way around. "Not for a while," I said. "Where are we going?" I had an old college friend named Brooks who'd moved out to the Shenandoah Valley 20 years ago, built a small farm, and seemed happier than almost anyone I'd known since Grace. I'd called him the week before. He had a spare room, a pond full of bass, and he'd said any time. "We're going to drive," I said. "Head west for a while, see some mountains." Finn thought about this. "Do I need snow boots?" "Probably," I said. At a red light on Broad Street, I reached into the glove compartment and handed him the pocket watch. He took it carefully, turned it over, heard it ticking. "You fixed it," he said. "It was never broken," I said. "It just needed someone to pay attention to it." He held it in both hands the rest of the way out of the city, watching the second hand move around the face. The mountains west of Richmond don't announce themselves. They grow gradually out of the horizon until you look up and realize you're already among them, and the city is somewhere behind you that you don't need to rush back to. I thought about Grace. I thought about the morning I'd told her we'd bought the Charlottesville location and she'd said, "Just promise me you'll know when to stop." I'd laughed and said I'd be the worst judge of that. She'd said, "I know. That's why I'm asking." We'd both laughed. It had been a good morning. I didn't regret the years. I didn't even regret my son, not exactly. I regretted what he'd become, which wasn't the same thing. Somewhere inside that man was the boy who used to follow me around the first store on Saturdays, asking what everything was for and why we stocked it, and how you knew when a tool was made right. That boy hadn't turned into nothing. He'd just gotten buried under the belief that having things was the same as deserving them. That's a mistake a lot of people make. I'm not sure it's entirely their fault. We don't teach the difference well enough. Finn fell asleep somewhere past Waynesboro, the watch still in his hand. I drove through the valley with the windows cracked and the radio low, and for the first time in longer than I could measure, I felt like a man who had done what he set out to do. I'd built something. I'd lost it for a while to someone who didn't understand its value. And then I'd taken back the part that mattered. Not the business, not the accounts, not the square footage or the inventory or the operating margins. I'd taken back what I could set in a boy's hands and say, this is what your great-great-grandfather carried in his pocket every single day, because he understood that some things are worth keeping close. Value isn't what something costs. It's what you were willing to do to keep it. Grace knew that. Harold the machinist knew it. And now, somewhere on a 2-lane road into the Shenandoah, with that watch ticking quietly in a sleeping boy's hand, I believed Finn was going to know it too.